I was standing on a terrace in Santorini, the light folding itself into blue and white like a promise, when my phone rang. It was Cole Blackwood. The sound of his name on my screen was always an interruption, an imperial summons coated in syrup, but that evening it felt obscene against the slow, soft noise of the Aegean. I let it go to voicemail because for 10 days I had told myself, and Garrett had agreed, that this was my vacation. No check-ins, no spreadsheets, no compromise. I had not been on a proper break in 4 years. I had booked this 10-day escape like a rebuke to the grind that had become my second skin. When I listened to the message, his voice filled the small hotel room, flat, impatient, without preamble. He berated me for taking time off, the usual litany about duty, continuity, presence. Then, in a single surgical sentence, he told me I was fired. The words landed with a sound I will never forget, a distant clink, like a bell in another country. I remember laughing first, one of those thin, surprised laughs that are half disbelief and half self-defense. Then the laughter stopped. The terrace blurred. I sat on the sun-warmed stone and felt the island spin into a different orbit. He thought he was ending my career. He was starting my freedom. That is the sentence that appears in every mind that hears the title of this story. And yes, fired by my CEO father-in-law while on approved vacation. It reads like a headline, but the headline was only the detonator. The years that followed were a slow supply chain of evidence, indignities, and choices that turned that single sentence into the axis for everything that came after. If this story hits a nerve, if you've ever been erased in a meeting, tokenized in a family-run company, or told to be grateful for crumbs, pause for a second and subscribe. Stories like this find the people who need them most when you do. I want to go back before the call, to where the work actually lived. People like tidy narratives. The hero rises, the villain falls. Real life is messier. For 4 years, I lived in detail. Models, margin lines, memo headers. Publicly, my business card said Senior Financial Analyst. Privately, the work read like a CFO's resume. I built 3-year cash flow models with multiple scenarios. I renegotiated vendor contracts that shaved millions off the cost base. I ran supplier audits, visited plants, and wrote risk reports that stretched 12 pages and concluded with an uncomfortable sentence about structural exposure. Concrete things anchor anger. I have a spreadsheet that shows a $6 million supplier savings consolidated across 3 contracts. I have a 12-page risk analysis, pages I wrote in the middle of a week where everyone else was sleeping, warning that the Lansing contract, as bid, would hemorrhage nearly $3 million if the stated assumptions didn't hold. I had a slide deck, time-stamped and emailed, projecting margin erosion if the cost of a critical component rose by 12%. These weren't notes in the margins. They were signed, dated deliverables that should have shifted how our leadership made decisions. Those deliverables shifted nothing, at least publicly. The pattern was invisible labor amplified by nepotism. A CFO-level fix, emails to suppliers, revised payment terms, would be executed by a junior director. Presentation slide decks would show metrics I had modeled, stripped of my name, and a different speaker would present them at the board meeting. I would be credited in passing, if at all. When I tried to push for promotion or title alignment, the response was neat and paternal. Pay isn't everything. We all pull together for the family. Praise was a currency reserved for certain people. Merit was a conversation with an expiry date. It's impossible to explain the slow psychic friction of being inside a family company where familial loyalty displaces competence. There is a daily erosion, little gestures that accumulate. An idea taken, a meeting scheduled without you, a quiet line in an email that reads as a rebuke but is delivered as counsel. It's domestic in scale and systemic in effect. Garrett and I, married then for 4 years, lived in the same house and orbited different centers. He wanted to do the right thing for the family business the way he had been taught to, defend the name, follow his father, avoid messy divides. I wanted the company to be clean and competent. We didn't have a joint language for that. The danger was not just being ignored, it was being assigned. There was an arc where every time I delivered a win, $6 million saved, a risky supplier renegotiated, a contract turned around, I was sent to do the thing no one else would. The solo audit in a plant with questionable safety records, a midnight site visit to a supplier that had cut corners on maintenance, a management of a recall scenario where protocols were thin and the machinery was old. The audits were cataloged under single-word headers in my calendar: Denham, Somerset, Lexington. Each of those visits had its own adrenaline economy: noisy assembly lines, forklifts turning corners with insufficient sight lines, workers doing overtime to patch problems. I left each site with documents, photos, and a list of fixes. I also left with a personal sense of jeopardy. At Denham, the plant manager took me to a corner of the floor and pointed out a gantry crane that hadn't been serviced in months. He shrugged and said, "We haven't had time." At Somerset, a loose bolt fell within feet of a worker's hand while I was taking photos. We called it a near miss. At Lexington, I found a contractor on the line using an improvised electrical tie that made me stop breathing for a minute. So still it felt like my chest had been edited out. I documented everything and sent it up the chain. Up the chain it disappeared, or it was filed under operational nuance. After each win, each dollar saved or risk averted, the company would schedule a follow-up audit under my direction, ostensibly to verify the improvement. I was sent alone. The dates were not random. They corresponded, in a way that would later feel unbearable, with financial success moments. If you are listening and you work in large systems, you know this. When one person consistently produces results without receiving the corresponding authority, that inconsistency gets explained away in cultural terms. At Blackwood, it was family loyalty. That phrase is a cloak. It allowed mistakes to persist and shielded the politics of succession. Cole's voice was everywhere, on the memos, in the casual asides at dinners, threaded through the company's assumptions. He was a man used to being the authority and seeing dissent as disloyalty. I will name one thing now, because it was the beginning of a pattern that later made my stomach drop: the Lansing bid. I had run a sensitivity analysis and flagged it, predicted losses if the cost assumptions didn't hold. I sent the analysis on March 2. The decision to proceed went ahead anyway. The board, led by Cole, bet that scale would squeeze margins back into green. The work I'd put in became the scaffolding everyone referenced when the numbers initially improved. 3 weeks later, the contract's early margins looked favorable, and I was told to run a post-win integration audit. A month after that, an unexpected component price spike exposed the vulnerability I'd warned about, and the underbid became visible in real dollars. Around the time of those swings, the company's life insurance figures started to look strange. That language is clinical because the feeling was anything but. Numbers began to have a texture of their own. When a corporate life insurance policy for a senior executive gets increased from $10 million to $18 million in the course of a quarter, it should be a matter requiring corporate governance review. These are not trivial numbers. They are financial instruments tied to human consequences, to balance sheets, to board minutes. The fact that an $18 million increase appeared in the records on March 18th, only days after financial wins, would in isolation read like a paperwork fluke. Except it was not a fluke. Later, it would be a hinge. Back at the terrace in Santorini, the thing I felt most violently was the accumulation. It hit me as an image, my spreadsheet stacked behind my head like a ledger of time I'd given away. Standing there, phone dark, beside an untouched glass of wine, I felt like someone who had been wearing a suit with the labels cut out for years, branded but anonymous, custom-made but uncredited. The first time I read Cole's message, I wanted to call back and argue. The second time I listened to the voicemail, I listened for something else, a tone that might explain a pattern. There was no explanation. There was only command. "He fired me," he said. He did not discuss performance metrics or a formal process. He did not make an offer to restructure, to mediate, to ask for a handover. He made a unilateral move. I spent 2 days in that suspended, lucid fog that vacations make possible, the kind of dislocation where grief and relief live in the same room. I had counterintuitive reactions. I was furious that he had chosen an embarrassing way to end 4 years of service. I was also, beneath the fury, a little medically ecstatic. There was an odd peace that came with someone else making the decision. I did not want it to be that simple. No one wants their life derailed by another person's ego. But there was an undeniable permission in being dismissed. Permission to reframe how my time mattered. On the third day, midway through an afternoon walk along the caldera, a man approached me at the small courtyard cafe as if we had an appointment. He had the casual confidence of someone who had been both lucky and deliberate, like someone who'd learned to cross a room and take up the center without asking permission. He introduced himself as Wyatt Brennan, CEO of Meridian Dynamics. I'd heard of Meridian. Everyone had. They were big, professional, and precise in a way Blackwood bulked through. We sat. He offered a bottle of wine with a look that suggested he wanted me relaxed but clear. He had read the headlines about an executive fired in Santorini, of course. News travels like weather when the players wear recognizable names. He did not open with condolences. He asked me a single pointed question. Do you want to keep doing the work you were doing, but for a place that will acknowledge it? It's a question I had asked myself in smaller ways for years. I answered with a dry yes. Wyatt slid a business card across the table and, in a way that felt both casual and heavily rehearsed, a slim black folder. I did not expect to accept anything. I had come to Santorini to be untethered. But his offer had precision. Meridian needed someone to lead a new East Coast division, someone who could shepherd manufacturing turnaround with financial discipline and moral clarity. It was a role that spoke not just to skills, but to a leadership ethic, full accountability, visibility for work, and the authority to act where necessary. He said the word CFO carefully. It landed like a title that had always fitted. Then he asked if he could show me something. I remember the light that washed over the caldera as he opened the folder. Here, in the middle of a Greek afternoon, technical documents slid into view like contraband. I looked down at a compact packet of printed pages, a set of balance sheet snapshots, audit notes, a redacted internal memo flagging safety violations, and an internal cash flow model that, when read as a whole, suggested a company whose wins were often papered over by structural losses in other product lines. Those were the things I lived in, the things most people had to be persuaded to see. The folder had an index. One line on it caught my eye before I was intellectually ready. Policy change, March 18. Life insurance increased to $18 million. My throat tightened in a small, ridiculous way, as if the folder had a pulse. He did not say much. He watched me read like someone comfortable with the discomfort of revelation. Then he said something that, in retrospect, was both an enticement and a warning. We think there's more here than bad operations. We think there may be patterns we need someone to connect. We need someone who knows how to make that connection and then build something out of the clean pieces. He spoke about ethics in the same breath as balance sheets. Show me the problem, fix it, and make sure people don't pay for the sins of leadership. There was a different kind of safety in Wyatt's words. For the first time in years, someone was offering me not just a seat, but an extension of authority that matched my responsibilities. He also gave me something else, assurance of resources. If it's what it looks like, we have the capacity to act fast, he said. He used words like diligence and due process. He mentioned his board in a way that suggested this would not be a family negotiation. It would be another set of rules. We talked until dusk. He did not make promises he could not keep. He made an offer, a role, real authority, and the freedom to assemble a team. He offered housing support for my transition. Nothing about the offer erased the fact that I had been humiliated over a voicemail, but it took the sting out of the outrage because it reframed it. This was not merely about getting let go. It was about moving into a place where the work I did would not vanish into someone else's monologue. Wyatt left me with the folder and a line that was more of a suggestion than a plea. Read it on your own terms. Call me if you want the job. If not, burn it. Either way, you choose. He smiled, as if his respect for my agency was commerce itself. That night in the hotel, I went through the papers with a focus that feels too methodical to be human. I made pencil marks. I compared dates. The documents were redacted in places, but the breadcrumbs were clear enough for someone who lived in ledgers. The internal cash flow model showed pockets of losses offset by perceived one-off gains. There were audit notes that read like CYA memos, and then there was that life insurance line on March 18. I pulled up my own calendars and emails. March 18 as a date was not an isolated moment in my work. It was a hinge point near the Lansing contract and the window when supplier costs had changed. Patterns began to assemble themselves like constellations. Sudden policy changes, solo audits scheduled shortly after wins, an increase in insurer exposure framed as a corporate decision. I closed the folder and felt, unavoidably, elements of horror. This is not melodrama. It is a threshold feeling, the moment when disparate facts begin to look like design. I had been fired, and in front of me, on a sunlit table in Santorini, were documents that suggested my firing could be more than an egotistical purge. It suggested a larger calculus at play. It suggested that the invisible labor I had been doing had not merely been stolen. It may have been folded into a pattern that benefited others in ways that made me small and possibly exposed me to danger. I thought absurdly of the near misses at Lexington and Denham. I remembered the loose bolt that fell, the gantry crane that hadn't been serviced, the improvised wiring. They had felt like operational failures then. Reading the folder, they began to take on new significance. Why send the person who detected the risk back to check? Why run an audit that would put them in proximity to continued hazard? The questions multiplied. The next morning, I walked quietly through the cobblestone streets and tried to imagine the future in a language other than outrage. The offer from Meridian was real. The folder in my bag was heavy with implication. I kept thinking of the phrase Wyatt had used, connect the dots. At the time, it sounded like a consultant's hyperbole. It would later feel like a summons. When I flew home, the sky was a short distance from grief. Airports are confessionals for the professional class. Every tote bag hides a lifetime of compromises. Garrett texted to ask how my trip had been. I typed back something noncommittal. I wasn't ready to explain that my vacation had been interrupted by a firing and a folder that might be a Pandora's box. There are truths that are hard to deliver in a text. The townhouse looked the way it always had, an outwardly calm domesticity with framed family photos that belonged to a life now largely misplaced. The company I had given long nights and steady Saturday mornings to was a few blocks away, a visible edifice, insulated by lawn and a layer of corporate PR. The decision made by was far larger than mine. I had options. That was the first pragmatic thought. I could accept Wyatt's offer. I could take the job and move on. I could be practical and salvage a career. Or I could do nothing and let the narrative be written for me. I did not want to be cataloged as someone who wilted. I wanted to be chosen on merit, not simply as collateral in a family drama. So I made a decision in that small, precise way people do when exhaustion sharpens their will. Sleep on it, but don't sleep through it. I called Patricia Strand, an attorney whom a former colleague had recommended, someone who had quietly navigated messy corporate family disputes before. She was crisp and asked 3 immediate questions. Were there written grounds for termination? Were you offered severance? Were any formal complaints or HR actions pending? I answered. The termination call was informal. No HR meeting, no written warning, no precedent.
They had offered a severance email that read generous if you read it as a severance agreement and signed away an awful lot. It came with a non-compete clause written in legalese so dense it looked like a fortress. It felt like an attempt to bury me politely. Patricia's voice over the phone was practical. Don't sign anything today. Let me see the severance. If this is a family play, there are ways to preserve your options. It was not legal advice offered to the camera. It was counsel in a voice honed by experience. It felt, for the first time since Cole's voicemail, like a tether to agency. There is a scene that stays with me. Me sitting at the kitchen counter, the folder Wyatt has left on the table like a black tide pooling into our domestic space. I thought of Garrett, of his father's voice, of the meetings where my numbers were read and presented as someone else's insight. I thought of the lonely audits and the near misses, and the $6 million line item on a spreadsheet that we had argued about. I thought of March 18th on a printout, an $18 million figure that connected in my head to the Lansing piece, and, like a stone thrown into still water, sent ripples across everything I thought I knew. By the time I went to bed that night, my hands were a little shaky. I lay awake thinking of what I had been given, termination and a folder that might be a map. I also thought of the choice Wyatt had offered me, authority to take action. I had always believed the best kind of revenge was succession, the slow, disciplined work of building something better than what tried to erase you. The folder felt like the beginning of that work, or at least the first page of it. When morning came, the house was quiet in a way it had not been in years. Garrett had left early, his routine, or perhaps avoidance. I couldn't tell. I poured coffee and opened the folder again. The documents were patient, unblinking, and relentless in their ordinary way. One page was an email trail for a policy change request. Another was an internal note about a deferred maintenance issue at a small assembly unit. The cash flow model had a footnote about contingent liabilities that read like a legal whisper. Follow-up required. The March 18th life insurance increase appeared again as a line in a table. On its own, it was a number. In pattern with everything else, it was a narrative vector. I sat there and did what I always do when the stakes are nouns and columns. I started to map. My fingers moved across the page, drawing lines between dates and events as if a flowchart could make sense of emotional truth. March 18th to Lansing bid. Lansing bid to supplier cost spike. Spike to audit. Audit assigned to me. March 18th to life insurance increase. It made a shape that was not conclusive, but it was vivid enough to wake me. You learn to be meticulous when you have to prove what you do.
The work of proof is not cinematic. It's a long series of patient corrections. Find the timestamp, archive the prior email, secure the PDFs, make sure metadata isn't altered. When you're used to that work, the first reaction to being wronged is not rage, it's discipline. Evidence is the engine of clarity. I had taught myself to trust it. I spent that day inventorying what I had. Copies of my models, the 12-page risk analysis, the supplier renegotiation emails where the $6 million figure came from, and the folder from Wyatt. I cataloged everything and sent a single message to Garrett. neutral, not accusatory, asking if we could talk. He didn't reply for hours. That evening, a new email arrived. It was succinct, a polite corporate tone my stomach recognized from 1,000 meetings. It was an offer of severance and a reminder about the confidentiality and non-compete clause. The legalese was a net, designed to be plausible and constricting if signed. I read it with a professional detachment that belied the internal tide rising behind my ribs. There are moments where choices reveal themselves in the texture of language. The severance told me what I already suspected. They expected me to be quiet. They expected my fatigue to be a surrender. I sat with that for a long time and then stood up and did something simple that feels huge in hindsight. I called Wyatt back and told him I would come in and talk. I called Patricia and asked her to start by reading the severance offer. With urgency, she said, so we could preserve options. I told my brother-in-law's assistant. I told the person who had been doing scheduling at the company for years that I wasn't going to be bullied into silence. When you move from being acted upon to acting, the world shifts. That shift is where the story truly begins, but it's also where this chapter pauses. I had been fired on a terrace in Santorini. I had a folder that suggested patterns I couldn't yet prove. I had an offer that could put me in a position to act. And I had a severance email that had the soft, neat cruelty of someone trying to tidy up a life they disrupted. I remember sitting back at the kitchen counter and looking out at the street where the delivery trucks rolled by with their dull corporate logos. The company was a few blocks away. Its name on the building was an emblem of everything I had loved and everything I had been invisible within. My phone buzzed, an unread message from an unknown number. I didn't open it. I wanted to be deliberate about what came next. There are two kinds of freedom, the sudden kind and the built one. The voicemail in Santorini had given me the sudden kind. The folder and the offer from Wyatt had given me the possibility of the built one. I chose to build. I did not know then how long that building would take.
I did not know how many late nights and forensic timestamps, how many tense council meetings and subpoenas, how many family arguments would fill the frame between that decision and any final reckoning. But I knew one thing clearly in my bones. I would not be erased again. I would turn the invisible work into visible change. That was the plan, and plans require evidence. Later that week at Meridian's offices, I would start to map the documents more fully. I would discover more correspondences, more dates that mattered. I would learn the difference between a coincidence and a pattern. But the moment that matters was the one on the terrace and the one at the kitchen table, the firing that liberated me and the folder that asked me to look. I closed the folder, put it back into the black sleeve, and felt the weight of it settle against my palm. The choice to act feels like an immense luxury until it is a necessity. I had options, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like my own. The line between being fired and being free was thinner than I had expected, and that line had been crossed under the Greek sun. I booked a flight back to the city the next morning. I landed back in the city with the folder under my arm and a cotton-scented exhaustion between my shoulder blades. Airports are where other people's routines look easy. The city felt like the opposite. At home, the same townhouse appliances hummed on schedule, but the house had shifted the way the light does when a new curtain is drawn. I moved through the rooms like someone in a house that belonged to other people's decisions. Meridian's office was a different climate. It smelled of new coffee and purpose. Wyatt met me in the lobby as if he had expected me, like a booked appointment. He did not hover. He offered a handshake that felt like an offer of territory, not pity. Over the next week, I met with the people he'd warned me I'd meet: the CFO of Meridian, 2 senior operations leads, a small intelligence team that handled acquisitions and diligence. The role on the table was real and detailed: an East Coast CFO with explicit authority over integration planning and a dotted line to operations. More important, it came with resources: forensic accountants, a private e-discovery vendor, and legal counsel ready to advise on whistleblower protections. They wanted someone who could move fast, and they meant it. I started in Meridian's temporary war room the way I always started any analysis, by making a list. The folder from Santorini went back into play, now accompanied by a stack of copies I made in a tiny legal office near my house. I cross-referenced dates, created timelines, and annotated the documents in pencil. March 2, my Lansing sensitivity sent. March 18th, life insurance increase noted. April, post-win audit scheduled under my direction. I printed the $6 million supplier savings spreadsheet I'd been assembling for 4 years and placed it under a yellow sticky note: provenance verified, original emails attached. The Meridian team watched my moves with that corporate curiosity that reads competence like a language. "We don't rush here," Wyatt said once, as if to signal patience, "but we don't stall either." We moved quickly. Meridian's forensic accountants began a metadata sweep of the documents we had, the emails in Blackwood's archive, file properties on the cash flow models, attachment timestamps. I knew the basics, what to ask for, what to preserve, but I let the specialists run the tools. There was no glamour to this phase. It was paperwork, verification, the 9-step choreographies of evidence preservation. I lived in that choreography for weeks, subtasks, checklists, chain of custody memos. I slept in a tiny company apartment at first. The first night I actually slept without waking, thinking of what had been done to me, felt like a small miracle. Then Sloan texted me. Sloan had always been an oddity in the family orbit, watchful, quick with an observation no one seemed to want to hear. For months she'd been someone I noticed in family photos, but rarely spoke with alone. Her message was short. "Can we meet? I have something." She suggested a coffee shop near her studio. I told Wyatt and Patricia that I had a lead. We arranged for a secured transfer of any material she might hand over. Patricia Strand, sharp, prescribed, and fiercely protective, was my counsel by then. Patricia had looped in Rebecca Torres, a whistleblower protection attorney, who advised us on the SEC route and the necessary steps to preserve whistleblower status and any related protections. We were trying to run forward while preserving every option. Sloan arrived with a small recorder and an expression I would later call brave, because that day courage looked like a soft, steady jaw. We sat in a back booth. Outside, people spoke in small bursts about lives that had not been cataloged into litigation. Sloan pushed the device across the table without dramatics. "You recorded him," I said. She nodded. "I couldn't keep living with the feeling that he thinks he can rewrite everything. I recorded for myself first. Then I realized, maybe this belongs to you." When we played it, Cole's voice filled the booth. It was the voice I knew, commanding, casual, practiced, but the content was the thing no family coffee table should contain. He spoke about smoothing the narrative, about backdating certain communications to establish a timeline that favored the company, and he referenced an operational strategy that sounded disturbingly like a design to move risk away from certain assets. Sloan's voice, faint in the recording, was the only other sound, an occasional prompt, a question.
The recording did not prove motive on its own, but it was an authenticated inside line, where Cole articulated plans in a way that matched the shapes we'd been tracing on paper. Sloan handed over a transcript she'd had forensically authenticated. Patricia took the device, looked at me and said, "We need to corroborate." She was not surprised by the content. Her legal mind had expected something like this once I'd told her about the folder. She instructed Sloan not to post anything, to let us handle verification through our channels. We did the verification work in slow vignettes. An e-discovery company compared Cole's email headers to internal mail logs, and an audio forensic lab examined Sloan's recording for edits and provenance. The labs confirmed the recording's authenticity, unbroken, unedited, with consistent source hallmarks. The transcript matched the audio and carried timestamps. When Patricia placed the transcript and the authenticated recorder in my hands, the weight of it was not small. It did not by itself equal proof of criminality, but it gave us a narrative vector, a recorded admission of strategizing, an internal memo that matched our patterns, and a dipping of the same date, March 18, through multiple documents. Patricia arranged a meeting with SEC agents Martin Voss and Sandra Pierce. I remember the room, a corporate conference table, a TV tucked in the corner, the practical sterility of government offices. Voss and Pierce listened to our presentation with a focus that made them feel like the last of the same people in a noisy world. We laid out the evidence in the order that matters, establish facts, eliminate coincidence, show pattern. The March 18 policy change showed up on an exported PDF. The life insurance increase email, confirmed to have been issued internally on March 18, was a line that had bureaucratic formality. The forensic analysis that showed backdated emails and metadata anomalies came next. The e-discovery team reported that several emails had header alterations consistent with addendum edits. Some attachments had properties that suggested changes made after the email's original sent timestamps. Neil Garson, the Blackwood IT director, would later explain what that meant in plain language at his deposition. Logs, when altered, leave traces. We did not need to teach the SEC anything. They had their own investigative rhythms, but we gave them the map. The SEC agents did not promise anything public in that room. They asked questions we had anticipated, and some we had not. They requested full access to our compiled materials and asked for a protected whistleblower channel to be opened so Sloan could be credited with undue exposure. Patricia and Rebecca provided the procedural scaffolding.
Rebecca in particular counseled Sloan on protections. She explained how internal documents must be preserved and how to avoid any careless disclosures that would compromise an investigation.
We moved forward with the careful speed of people who understood consequences. If an allegation is to become a case, you do not leak the headline, you build the threads. As the SEC opened a preliminary inquiry, Meridian ramped up the pressure on the operational work. They hired additional forensic accountants and began a parallel civil-level examination of potential fraud and misrepresentation. My role became twofold. I was a secure source of corporate truth for Meridian and a witness for the regulatory process. That duality changed how I slept and how I spoke. I learned new jargon, chain of custody, probative value, forensic imaging, but I also relied on the old language of number and narrative. Numbers were my native terrain. Meanwhile, the family's response was a staged attempt at containment. There were offers of severance revised with asterisks, generated non-disclosure agreements with clauses meant to be elastic. Garrett, who had been more reticent than coercive at first, sent messages that shifted in tone, emails that asked for mediation one day and divorce papers the next. The divorce filings appeared, signed, dated, delivered by his counsel. I learned later that he had felt cornered by his father's maneuvers, that his signature had been a way to mark a line between loyalty and self-preservation. That did not soften the blow. The legal separation was finalized in stages, each one a small shuddering. The marriage we had once expected to weather disruptions unraveled with a clinical efficiency. There was also a public side to this. The morning that the SEC filed investigative notice, an event I had been told to expect, and yet which still felt like a distant thunderclap, Cole's name drifted into the papers. Headlines ran procedural language. SEC opens inquiry into Blackwood Manufacturing. There were photos of the plant and the PR team's busy statements about cooperation. Blackwood's stock, if you can call a middle-market private company's valuation a stock in the rhetorical sense, wavered. Cole issued a corporate statement talking about operational realignment and unfounded allegations, the now familiar script of corporate obfuscation. It didn't work the way it had for him in private. The public record now framed questions that a private voicemail had been allowed to drown out. Neil Garson's role shifted as our case hardened. He had been an in-house player, competent, overlooked, technically good at preserving logs in ways companies aren't always proud of. When our e-discovery flagged anomalies, Neil's metadata records provided corroboration. There was a moment in a deposition room when I watched him, quiet, careful, explain the timeline of message headers and server logs. He didn't speak as someone who enjoyed the role. He spoke like someone who finally decided that documents deserved a truthful reading.
When he testified to the existence of backups, and then to the presence of edits that didn't align with the original send times, the courtroom, or rather the deposition room that spooled into later court testimony, leaned forward. Neil's cooperation was consequential. Patricia had spent a long evening coaxing him into agreement. Money did not appear to be his motivation. He told us later, with a small, hollowed-out look, that he wanted the ledger to be right. The criminal investigation accelerated after a forensic lab produced a summary report indicating backdated emails and manipulated attachment timestamps, evidence that suggested actions had been taken to manufacture a paper trail. We handed that report to the SEC. That document also flagged the March 18 life insurance increase as an unusual corporate action occurring in temporal proximity to the documented financial wins. When you read numbers across dates, human pattern recognition is unavoidable. The life insurance change was not proof of intent, but it fit into a pattern that had become persuasive. Altered records, suspicious policy changes, and a pattern of endangering audits. Cole was arrested after a court found probable cause. The news cycle compressed everything we had been living into a headline. The moment I watched the footage of his arrest, plainclothes officers moving with a functionary's efficiency, there was no trumpeting victory in my chest. I felt a peculiar, heavy quiet, as if a door had shut behind an argument and the room had simply kept breathing. Arrest is not conviction. Arrest is a milestone in a process. In the weeks that followed, we prepared for the courtroom with the same discipline we had used on spreadsheets. Trial was a procedural animal. There was testimony, Neil's, Sloan's, the forensic analysts, and there were hearings, motions, evidentiary rulings. The prosecution laid out a pattern. The defense tried to reframe, to paper over anomalies with plausible deniability. I sat through testimony with an odd professional calm that I hadn't expected.
When Sloane described why she recorded her father, her voice steady, the words measured, I felt a wash of gratitude so intense that it left me strange and hollow. She had been the marginal one in the family's frame. In the courtroom, she was a central witness. Patricia and Rebecca prepared me for cross-examination. We rehearsed, not to manufacture a persona, but to make sure my testimony would be precise, anchored in documents, and devoid of the rhetorical heat that makes juries skeptical. I testified to the dates, the emails, the models I'd authored, the audits I had been assigned, and why. I described the March 2 Lansing sensitivity analysis and the March 18 policy change. I answered questions about the supplier renegotiations and the $6 million in savings, about the solo audits I had conducted and the near misses at Denham and Lexington. I did not moralize. I stated facts and showed the evidence.
Neil and the forensic analysts explained the metadata anomalies in ways the jury could grasp, what a timestamp was, why server logs matter, how an edit leaves a detectable trail. Voss and Pierce, the SEC's agents, had prepared the civil case with a careful crosswalk of documents that aligned with the criminal allegations. There were moments of real drama. The playback of Sloane's recording in court was a quiet, devastating event. Cole's face, which had been practiced in public, showed a fracture. The prosecution's case, in plain terms, tied together an operational pattern with internal manipulations and problematic policy changes. The defense insisted on innocent explanations, clerical errors, miscommunications, human error. The jury, after days of careful listening to witnesses and evidence, found in favor of the prosecution. Cole was convicted on the charges the indictment specified. The conviction was a form of public accountability. Sentencing would follow the due course of law. The transcripts and the press accounts used language that felt both distant and intensely final. Guilty verdict, sentenced to a multi-year term. The exact term appearing in the record was not a detail I could responsibly paraphrase beyond what the court filed, so for the narrative here, the length is indefinito. In private, we waited for formal orders and the sentencing hearing. There was relief, yes, but it was mixed with a sense of something missing. No legal outcome can recover relationships, or the private damage of repeated erasure. The conviction was an institutional vindication. It did not fold back the hours or bring back hours away from home. While the legal processes were unfolding, Meridian moved toward a concrete business solution. The Precision Equipment Division at Blackwood, units that had been quietly profitable and valuable despite the company's broader structural issues, was of strategic interest. Meridian had been tracking it, part of what Wyatt had shown me in the Santorini folder, and once the criminal inquiry escalated, the commercial logic of acquiring a solid division became urgent. The plans we crafted in the war room were practical and morally aligned. Buy the division, preserve employment, and institute governance rules that would prevent the pattern we'd exposed from repeating. The acquisition process was surgical. We pitched the plan to Meridian's board, a $40 million offer for the Precision Equipment Division, structured to include guarantees for the 200 employees tied to its operations. I drove the financial modeling and integration planning. Meridian trusted the numbers because they were built by someone who had been in the trenches. The bid was a mixture of market valuation and a moral calculus. We wanted to take assets that could be run honorably and keep people employed. The negotiations with Blackwood's interim leadership involved legal counsel and a recognition that the company had been weakened by the public investigation.
When the deal closed, the terms included full employment protections for the division's staff for a defined period, severance packages for key employees, and an integration playbook that emphasized safety audits and independent oversight. On the day we announced the acquisition, I stood on a small stage in a Meridian conference room and watched faces that had known only fear look like the possibility of normalcy again. There were employees who had been anxious about layoffs, caretakers who had been told to budget as if their jobs were fragile. The terms we negotiated gave them breathing room. I thought of Denham and Lexington, of the gantry crane and the loose bolt. We instituted an independent safety review board and established a whistleblower hotline with a third-party administrator. The messaging was clear. We wanted to model a different way of working. Becoming Meridian CFO for the East Coast Division was not an achievement I kept privately as a trophy. It was a platform, and I approached it that way. My first weeks were spent on safety audits and on rebuilding relationships with managers who had been burned by the previous regime. There were tactical wins, renegotiated supplier terms, operational efficiency programs, but the more lasting work was cultural. We created a governance structure with clear lines of accountability and a visible chain of command. We published safety metrics and updated training. We instituted a policy that any contractor's safety certification be confirmed by an independent auditor before work commenced. These were small things in one sense, but they were the opposite of what had allowed risk to be shuffled in the past. Saving 200 jobs did not feel like revenge, it felt like stewardship. That ethic, saving the workers rather than gloating over the company's collapse, became a pillar of how we framed the acquisition. I thought of the people I'd met on those plant floors, the faces behind the forklifts and assembly lines. For them, the work we had done was not a moral victory, it was economic lifeline. We emphasized transition support and invested in training programs to modernize skills where necessary. The professional fulfillment was layered with personal cost. The divorce finalized in paperwork that had the flat, inked finality of a corporate memo. Garrett signed away pieces of our life in prose that read like a balance sheet. Family ties severed with a clarity that made some days feel like a ledger closed. Sloan and I remained connected in complicated ways. She moved her life into a small studio and started to paint scenes of industrial interiors, machines translated into brushstrokes. Her work felt like therapy and protest. We were estranged from parts of our family in a way that was becoming permanent. That was a sadness that did not heal quickly. There were days after the conviction when the city felt quiet in a way that had nothing to do with law or victory.
I had moments when walking along the Hudson River, the wind trading clean air for a kind of calm I hadn't earned. I thought of custody of evidence and custody of self. The victory in court had not cured the years where my work had been invisible. Recovery, for me, became a matter of reconciling the identity that had been erased with the one I now had the authority to inhabit. The public reaction to the case surprised me in small ways. People wrote in with their stories, women who had been sidelined, men who had watched others take credit, employees who were relieved the division had a chance to survive. There were also quieter notes, an old colleague who said simply, "You made it procedural, that's how it had to be." Those messages did something practical to the grieving places inside me. They reminded me that the process mattered beyond ego, it mattered for systems. At Meridian, the immediate work of integration occupied my days, but I also took on a role that felt essential yet odd, a visible leader who had to model the kind of comportment I wanted. I insisted on town halls where managers would answer direct questions about safety and compensation. I walked plant floors wearing the same hard hat as anyone else and listened to complaints without preemptive defensiveness. The old Blackwood pattern had been secrecy and paternalism. We chose transparency and shared accountability. The difference was not instantaneous, but it was real. I measured it in employee retention, in the number of safety incidents reported, there were fewer, and in the tone of internal communications. When we delivered the first quarterly financials post-acquisition, the numbers weren't just green in a spreadsheet, they were the result of systems that had moved from risk to resilience. There were practical challenges that had nothing to do with heroes and villains. Integration is messy and human. Systems don't reconfigure overnight. There were pockets where old practices lingered. We addressed them one by one. A supplier that had been paid late, a managerial team that needed new training, a maintenance budget that required a rethink. Each solved item was a small victory, not cinematic, but tangible. Emotionally, I discovered the peculiar nature of a victory that's both satisfying and hollow. The conviction did not stitch back the evenings when my contributions were repackaged, nor did it resurrect friendships severed by loyalty to a man who had been found guilty. There were losses that legal remedies cannot touch: a marriage, family trust, the private sense that home was unassailable. The court had delivered retribution. It could not return the past. That reality required a different kind of work. So I began to reconstruct my life with the same discipline I used on balance sheets. I rented an apartment by the river, an open place where the light folded into the panes, and set up a small studio. I started to teach a non-credit leadership clinic at a nearby business school, speaking to women about visibility, governance, and ethical leadership. Teaching was an unexpected balm. When I explained the importance of chain of custody to a room of future managers, they didn't yawn, they listened. When I spoke about the necessity of institutionalizing safety, there was gratitude in the room. The most meaningful part of that work was not my voice. It was the questions that bubbled up from people who had never had the language to name the harms they'd endured. Sloan's art began to get noticed in small exhibitions.
She painted machinery with a tenderness that made people who had known nothing of factory life stop and read the brushstrokes like testimony. We, Sloan and I, and a handful of colleagues who had been through the trial, would sometimes meet to eat and to feel the ordinary rhythms that are a form of recovery. Coffee with no agenda, a walk with no analytic point. Those moments, small as they were, became the scaffolding of a life that was not defined by litigation. I have been asked in interviews, in emails, and in small glassy questions what felt like the triumphant climax of the story. People imagine a movie beat, the microphone drop, the parade, the award. What I would say is this: the triumphant beat was not a single moment. It was a string of practical, sometimes small acts. Refusing to sign a severance that would have silenced me, documenting a risk report so meticulously it could be read in court, agreeing to take a job that put me in a position to do the hard work of acquisition and integration, insisting on employment protections in a deal that could have been purely extractive. The comeback was professional and ethical. It was the use of authority to repair harm rather than to gloat over it. People who watch this and are in the position I once was, undervalued, tokenized in a family-run business, or erased in a workplace, often ask me what concrete steps they can take. I cannot give legal advice, but I can say what I did. Preserve your artifacts. Keep copies of your work with timestamps. Cultivate witnesses. Find counsel you trust. Document patterns as patiently as you do any model. Evidence is not vindictive, it is protective. The process of building a case is also a process of reclaiming agency. There were scenes of catharsis. A quiet phone call where I told a former subordinate that he would have a job under Meridian and did not need to fear the layoffs that had shadowed his family. The moment we cut the ribbon at a refurbished plant and the workers clapped not for me, but for a program that would keep their shifts safe. A letter from a former colleague who said simply, "You gave me permission to be visible." Those were more meaningful than any heady public sanction. Time, as it tends to do, blurred the edges of trauma and victory.
There are afternoons where I still feel a sharp memory of standing under a gantry crane with the sound of the plant in my ears. There are nights where the absence of a conversation with someone who was once my husband sits like a space on the sofa. But alongside the grief sits a clear principle. The best remedy to being erased is to make a thing that refuses erasure. For me, that thing was building a division that would be governed differently and would keep people safe. On the day Meridian closed the acquisition, we sent a packet of documents to the new employees: contracts, benefits details, safety commitments, and a letter explaining the governance changes. I wrote the preface to that letter. I told them in plain language why we had insisted on certain clauses. I also invited them to participate in governance forums, to be part of a safety committee that reported to an independent board member. It wasn't a speech, it was policy. There is a quiet part of me that still relishes irony, how a voicemail meant to humiliate became the detonator for a whole new life. But I guard that joy. It is not the point. The point is that one sentence, "You're fired," did not end the narrative it was meant to end. Instead, it exposed a set of mechanisms that needed correction. The comeback was not a revenge story, it was repair. In the months after the finalization of legal processes, I walked into the plant in a hard hat for the first time as Meridian CFO. The assembly lines smelled like oil and the tang of productivity. A manager I didn't know came up and patted my shoulder with a rough hand and said, "You came for the work." It was the observation of someone who measures people by what they do, not by pedigrees. I thought of the $6 million savings line and the Lansing memo, and of the March 18th spreadsheet that had helped me piece a pattern together. I thought of Sloan's recorder and Neil's testimony. I thought of Patricia and Rebecca and their steady, unflashy competence. In quiet moments, people ask if I feel vindicated. The answer is complicated. There is vindication in accountability. There is also an acceptance that legal outcomes do not erase personal cost. The conviction and the acquisition did not put my marriage back together or make years of erased labor vanish. What they did was allow me to repurpose the energy and expertise that had been misused. They allowed me to lead an organization where transparency and safety were not optional. When I look at the headline that brought people here, "Fired by my CEO father-in-law on vacation," There is a satisfaction that the title is literal, not hyperbole. I was fired on a terrace in Santorini, and that firing began a chain that culminated in a professional rebirth. The comeback was not instantaneous. It was built with the same patient labor I had always used on financial models: evidence, method, integrity, and a willingness to do the unpopular work of institutional repair.
If there is a moral to leave, it is this: the best revenge is not the theatrics of retribution. The best revenge, if you can call it that, is building something that refuses the patterns that harmed you. It is taking invisible labor and making it visible. It is making a commitment in policy and practice to protect the people who matter. It is leading in a way that is slow, tedious at times, and inevitably bureaucratic. That is the work that produces sustained change. There are days I look at my calendar and see the small markers of ordinary life: a dentist appointment, a board meeting, a coffee with Sloan, and I find them steadier than any headline could be. Justice, in the institutional sense, was achieved. The personal work of repair continues, but the arc of the story: fired on vacation, a folder in my bag, a recording in Sloan's hand, legal action that held leadership accountable, a conviction, and then a principled acquisition that saved 200 jobs, stands as a sequence that validated more than a single moment of indignation. It validated the idea that systems can be corrected if competent people insist on proof, if counsel is trusted, and if those with resources decide to act ethically. If anything in my account resonates with you, if you've ever been tokenized, if you've ever had your work made invisible, know this: meticulousness matters, evidence matters, and allies matter, even the ones that arrive unexpectedly on a Santorini terrace. Thanks for listening to this longer account. If a part of this story landed with you, tell me which moment surprised you most in the comments. Subscribe if you want more survivor to success stories and discussions about building ethical workplaces. These conversations need a wider audience.